Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I am showing off my new guitar. It is a 2019 Gretsch G6120 Chet Atkins model. And I've wanted one of these for such a long time, like maybe over 15 years. And I finally got one a few weeks ago for my birthday with the help of some family members. So I'm really excited to show this thing off to you. I did a live stream last week that kind of went astray because of technical difficulties, so no one could actually even hear what this guitar sounded like. So today I'm going to go in depth into the history of this model, why I wanted one. You're going to hear me play it and hear it against my Gretsch Tennessean and Michael's Country Gentleman. But before I dive in, if you don't mind clicking subscribe and going to my Patreon, patreon.com/SamPopkin, where you can find Beatles tabs and unreleased videos and all sorts of cool stuff. So check it out. All right, so why did I want one of these so badly? Well, it is a Beatle guitar. John Lennon used one of these during the Revolver sessions, but he quickly got rid of it and gave it to his cousin, and he only plays it on really 2 or 3 Beatles tracks. So I will use this for Beatles covers, but mainly the reason I got this was because of Pete Townshend from The Who. When I was 11 years old, my guitar heroes were Angus Young and Jimmy Page and David Gilmour and Brian May. The Beatles go without saying, but Pete Townshend was always my favorite guitarist and still is to this day. Pete played a Gibson SG Special during the albums Tommy and Live at Leeds in 1969 and 1970. And then in 1971, he moved to the Gretsch 6120. And there was a great website that's still around, thewho.net, that has all of Pete's gear listed throughout the years, and it's very accurate. So check that out for more information about Pete's guitars. So anyway, I was young, and my first guitars were a Telecaster and a Les Paul. And it was really hard to afford one of these. This goes new for about $3,500. So I would go into guitar stores and look at them, play them, but you know, it was always kind of a dream guitar that I knew would come much later. So the Tele and the Les Paul were my main staples for about 8 to 10 years, and then I got my Sonic Blue Strat in 2015. I always wanted one of those because of the Beatles and Rubber Soul. I almost got one of these instead, but it just was always just slightly too expensive. My fourth guitar, electric guitar that I got, was a Gretsch in 2018, but it was a Tennessean model. I still have that, and it's a real vintage 1967 Gretsch Tennessean. And, you know, George Harrison played that on Help and Rubber Soul. So that was, you know, a fantastic guitar to purchase. And I always knew that it wasn't a real substitute for the 6120. It was just a different thing that's really cool. I think Gretsch has so much to offer, and you know, the Tennessean became a British invasion guitar that George Harrison and, you know, Jerry Marsden and Hilton Valentine used. All those great British 60s bands used Gretsch Tennesseans rather. But anyway, in the back of my mind, I always knew the 6120 was the dream guitar for me, as well as the Gibson SG Special. I didn't really have a true Pete Townshend guitar, so in 2020 I got my SG Special. It's a real 1970 model that I got at Rudy's Music in New York City, and that was incredibly exciting because the SG Special was pretty much as this, it was a dream guitar for me. So that was the first step with Pete's guitars for me. I could do Tommy stuff and Live at Leeds and all that. But this was the 5th one that I really wanted. You know, as much as the Tennessean is great, as much as my Epiphone Casino is great and my Rick 12 and all that, my 5 guitars that I would take to a desert island would be the Tele, Les Paul, Sonic Blue Strat, SG Special, and this thing now. So I feel like I've come full circle in buying this thing, mainly because of Pete Townshend, but I'll show you some other examples where it was used that were very inspiring to me as well. So let's get into some of the history and specs of this model. I would recommend, though, going to 5 Watt World Keith's channel, because Keith goes into more depth about the 6120s and all sorts of guitars. He's just got so much knowledge and knows a lot more than me, so I definitely recommend 5 Watt World's video on the 6120. That being said, let's dive in. So 1954, the 6120 came out. It looked a bit different from this, but it was a Chet Atkins signature model. So Gretsch approached Chet the same way that Gibson approached Les Paul in the early 50s to make a signature guitar. And Chet agreed and had some input about what he wanted, but pretty much Gretsch ran wild, created the Western orange look, and they put on like cactuses and cows and stuff on the inlays, and like a G brand for Gretsch on the body, and the horseshoe, of course. And Chet was not really pleased with that, and eventually in about 1957 they got rid of a lot of that stuff, and it looks more like this, which is a 1959 reissue. So in 1958 they moved to the Filtertrons. These are humbucking pickups. Before that, they were Dynasonic single coils, the same one that you know is in George Harrison's Gretsch Duo Jet, which are single coils, a lot more twangy. So the 57, 58 Filtertrons were one of the earliest humbuckers, in competition with Gibson's PAF humbuckers. So that was new, and the thumbnail inlays were new. But yeah, you basically have a volume knob for each pickup. You have a master volume knob, and then you have your tone selector and pickup selector. Before 1958, there was a third tone knob, and there was no tone switch, which is known as the mud switch. So in 1958, 1959, this model did not have a tone knob. All you have is just tone switches, the mud switch. So it pretty much stayed the same 1958, 1959 like this. In 1960, they reduced the depth of the body, became a bit thinner in depth. And then in 1961, it became even thinner, and they totally changed the entire guitar. It became double cutaway, and they made it fake F-holes instead of real F-holes. So in 1961, it changed to pretty much what the Gretsch Country Gentleman is that you see back here, like Michael's, except that it's orange, and it has a slightly thinner body width to it. This is 16 inches, like the Tennessean. The Gretsch Country Gentleman is 17 inches wide. So other than that, this basically became like a Country Gentleman. And the 60s saw a few more changes, like they got rid of the horseshoe logo and put a nameplate on there with Chet Atkins. And then eventually Baldwin acquired Gretsch in 67, and it became a much different company and kind of went downhill. So that's pretty much the golden era of the Gretsch years with this guitar. So let's talk about Chet Atkins for a bit and the early 50s players who played these things. So Chet, of course, played the Chet Atkins model. This didn't have a name the way that the Country Gentleman or the Tennessean were named, but eventually in the 60s they called this the Nashville model. But before that, it was just Chet Atkins' signature. So Chet played this until the Country Gentleman was made. That kind of became his main guitar for a bit. But you can see Chet playing a 6120 on TV doing Mr. Sandman is probably the best example. Some other great players in the 50s who used this were Duane Eddy used the early Dynasonic 50s model on Rebel Rouser and all those great twangy instrumentals that you'll hear. And then my personal favorite 1950s player of the 6120 is Eddie Cochran of 20 Flight Rock fame, the song that got Paul McCartney into the Beatles. He played a 6120 that he actually modded quite a bit. So Eddie put in a P90 single coil pickup in the neck. His would have had Dynasonics in it. It was a 1955 model, so different from this. But essentially, he put in a P90 and he like boiled down the pickguard to make it translucent. So that Eddie Cochran model is something they've reissued and has become, you know, kind of a classic look on its own. But Eddie is one of my favorite 1950s musicians in general, and I love the twangy stuff that he gets in the middle position of the P90 and the Dynasonic. Some other 1950s players who used these were Ritchie Valens and James Burton. James Burton used a Fender Telecaster on the recordings for Ricky Nelson before he eventually became Elvis Presley's guitar player. But during the music video shoots, he would actually play a 6120 just because it was an expensive deluxe model at the time. And the Fenders kind of looked cheapish compared to the Gretsches. So that actually happened as well for Ritchie Valens. Ritchie Valens was famous for playing a Fender Stratocaster in the studio, but in movies and music videos, he would sometimes play the 6120. So that brings us to the 1960s. Obviously, in 61, the model changed a lot, became a double cutaway and fake F-holes and all that. And the British guys really took to it. Obviously, I mentioned a lot of Gretsch Tennessean players from the 60s, like George Harrison and Jerry from Jerry and the Pacemakers, but some other British invasion acts also used the 6120. Most notably, besides John Lennon later on, Paul Atkinson from the Zombies used a 1960s model 6120 on their first album. So you can hear that on She's Not There and Roadrunner and all the early Zombies stuff is a 6120. Some other great 60s players included Eric Clapton, who used one in the Yardbirds for a hot minute before moving on to a Telecaster. There's some other interesting groups like the Whackers. I learned this from Ryan Martin. He sent me this Swinging 60s movie where you can see the band The Whackers, who I don't really know, playing a 6120. And then that brings us, of course, to John Lennon. So in 1966, during Revolver, John got a 1965 model 6120 double cutaway, and he played that on Paperback Writer, not the main riff that you hear, but the background tremolo stuff. And in Rain as well, the background strumming guitar is a 6120. There's some debate about what guitar he played on And Your Bird Can Sing, the chords. Some people think it was the 6120. Some people think Strat or Casino. It's not really clear, but I'll definitely do some shootouts and so you guys can kind of hear for yourself. But it's possible this made it onto the Revolver album itself. Paperback Writer and Rain were just singles. And then John gave it away to his cousin and never really wanted it back. So it was a very quick history in terms of the Beatles usage. So then in the mid-60s, besides the British stuff, there's some great American records that used one of these. So there was a recording studio in Alabama called Muscle Shoals that was famous for Aretha Franklin and the Stones and Wilson Pickett and all sorts of groups. And the session guys were called the Swampers, and they were mostly white guys who were playing on these black R&B records. And the Swampers included a guitarist named Jimmy Johnson. And I learned a lot about this through the channel Ask Zach, Zach Child. So go check him out. He actually interviewed Jimmy Johnson before he died. And he talks about owning one of these. It was actually a 1959 or 58 model of 6120. And it's the guitar that you hear on a lot of those classic Aretha records like Respect. And he also used it on Wilson Pickett, Land of a Thousand Dances, and some really great twangy R&B recordings from Muscle Shoals and Stax. The other swamper that I should mention is Joe South, who was a 60s guy that played on a lot of session work with Aretha and other guys. He actually performed on Sounds of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel, not the song itself, but on that album. He played a 6120. It was actually an earlier 50s model with the Dynasonics. And he plays that on songs like I Am a Rock and Blessed and other ones. And then he went on to play in Nashville with Bob Dylan on Blonde. And you can hear Joe South's playing of a 6120 most famously on Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again. He's doing some great double stops on that record. So that brings us to the late 60s and early 70s, which is really my favorite era of 6120 playing, because you have Neil Young playing one of these in Buffalo Springfield in 67, 68. So Neil had a 1959, or I think it was maybe a 1960 model with the slightly thinner body depth. But he owned a few of them because Stephen Stills was in that group as well. Him and Steve used 6120s and then went on later to use White Falcons. When Neil joined Crosby, Stills, and Nash, he played his 6120 on live recordings like the Big Sur Festival and live on TV with Tom Jones. You can see him playing the 6120, and Stills is playing his White Falcon. So the 6120 made it onto some Buffalo Springfield records, most famously For What It's Worth, the tremolo harmonic famous part. Neil might have used it during Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young, or maybe during his Crazy Horse years, but it's kind of unclear because he had moved on to the White Falcon mostly. But his Crazy Horse rhythm guitarist, Danny Whitten, used a 6120. So it does make it onto Live at the Fillmore and some of those Crazy Horse recordings. My personal favorite Neil Young album is After the Gold Rush. And on the back cover, or maybe like the inside sleeve or something, you can see a 6120 lying next to Neil. So I kind of always thought, you know, when I was younger, that Neil played one of these on like Southern Man and songs like that, which it's possible a 6120 made it onto After the Gold Rush because Danny Whitten is, you know, in Crazy Horse was playing rhythm on that album. So somewhere in there probably is a 6120 or maybe just a White Falcon. The White Falcons they had were 50s models that also had Filtertrons and real F-holes. So it's not that far off tonally from this guitar either way. So that brings us to Pete Townshend in 1971, got his first 6120. And this is an interesting story. So as I said before, Pete used the SG Special on Tommy and Live at Leeds. And in 1971, Joe Walsh, who later joined the Eagles, was a good friend of Pete's. And Joe Walsh gifted Pete 6120 from 1959. It looked pretty much exactly like this, although he took the pickguard off. And Joe Walsh gave him that and a Fender Tweed Bandmaster amp, which is an unusual amp because it has 3 speakers in it. And he gave Pete a volume pedal. So all 3 of those things he gifted to Pete at once when the Who were recording the Lifehouse project, which later became Who's Next. So the early Lifehouse recordings had Pete playing SG, and then he is gifted this guitar from Joe, and he, goes to get it from Joe, thanks him, and he opens the case and he sees this orange hollow body, and he thinks, ugh, that's kind of gross looking. It's really cheesy. I don't like it. At least by the look of it, it just looks terrible. But he said that later on, that night, he plugged this guitar into the Tweed Bandmaster, turned the amp up, and hit a chord, and it was just like magic. It's the recording tone that you hear on Baba O'Reilly and Won't Get Fooled Again. And there's something about those 3 speakers in the amp create an odd impedance, and he said even the volume pedal added something tonally. Later on he would say that if he ever tried to introduce a different guitar or a different amp into the equation or a pedal, it just wouldn't do the trick. It always had to be this, a Bandmaster, and the volume pedal together. So he immediately took to using that guitar in the studio. He didn't really use it live much at all, although you do see it in 1973 at the Rainbow concert with Eric Clapton. Eric actually used Blackie, his Strat, and Lucy Les Paul, George's Les Paul, and Pete used the 6120 live with his Bandmaster. So anyway, Pete used this on Who's Next, all of those incredible recordings. You can even hear the volume pedal on Bargain and some other songs. On The Song Is Over from Who's Next, he actually plugged this into a Leslie speaker. So that was kind of an interesting tone he got there. He went on to use the same exact setup, the Bandmaster and the 6120, on Quadrophenia, their next rock opera in 1973. And he actually also used a Fender Strat, a 50s Strat that Eric Clapton gave to him on that album as well. The Who.net lists all of the, songs that he played the Strat on, songs he played the 6120 on, so you can see that. When the Who finished recording Quadrophenia, he brought this to the Top of the Pops for a music video shoot of 515. The Who really wanted to perform it live, but the BBC had a policy that the bands could sing live to it, but they always had to perform to a track that was pre-recorded. And Pete just hated that. He just thought that was so stupid. So anyway, at the end of the song, you can see Pete smash the 6120, and the BBC start to throw actual wigs at him, and he starts flipping them off to the camera, and obviously recording went black, and they were banned from the BBC forever after that. But that was kind of sad because it was a 1959 6120, not many of them made, and Pete smashed it, as he did many guitars in his career. But fortunately, after that, Pete was able to resurrect the smashed guitar. and he still used it on some recordings, although he might have bought a different 6120 at that time, because you see a slightly different looking Bigsby during the 1975 sessions for the Who by Numbers. He used a 6120, and the album Rough Mix with Ronnie Lane, he used one as well. So it's unclear if it was the original 59 or if it was like a 1960 model that he with a different Bigsby that he got. So regardless, it's great that he put the guitar back together, because you can see Pete using his original 59 on White City from the 80s, and up until the present day he's still using that thing. So somehow the guitar survived the fated BBC smash. But those Who's Next recordings alone for me were enough reason just to buy this guitar alone. So definitely going to be doing some Who's Next covers with this. So that brings us to more of the modern day, at least from the 1980s, 90s onward. The most famous guitarist who used a 6120 arguably is Brian Setzer, the rockabilly guitarist from Long Island, New York. I never really knew much about Brian Setzer and never really got into his music until recently, when I was gearing up to buy one of these things. And I just think Brian is incredible. Like, what a great singer, what a great player. He even covers some of my favorite Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent songs. And his story is kind of funny with the 6120. He wanted one because of Eddie Cochran. And in Long Island, back in those days in the 80s, there weren't a lot of these around. And he found in some newspaper listing, orange Gretsch for sale. And that was enough for him to go check it out. And when he got there, all of the hardware and the pickups and everything were in a separate box, and it was just like an empty shell of a guitar. So he was kind of like, all right. And he bought it, and it was, a 1959 model, different from Eddie's, but it's the guitar that he used in the Stray Cats. And I guess it didn't come with all of the knobs, because then he put his dice knobs on, and Gretsch makes signature Brian Setzer guitars with the dice and everything on it. My favorite musician of all time, Bruce Springsteen, though, he used one of these more recently. In like 2005, he took one out on the road. I saw him on that tour. And then for his movie Western Stars and the album, he used one of these on Tucson Train. You can see this in his recording studio. He has a 59 model, could be a 58. But you also see him use that in Letter to You, the movie and the music video for that song. He uses it for kind of twangy lead tones, which is interesting because Bruce is really a Telecaster player. So even he, has taken to the 6120. So anyway, that brings us to my guitar. So I finally got this thing a few weeks ago on Reverb from Rock and Roll Vintage. They're a store in Chicago. And there were many different reissues and, models to choose from, the newer ones. I could never afford an original 50s. They're about $15,000 for at least the single cut one that I want. You can get the double cutaway version for like $3,000 or something like that. But I always wanted one of these. And a lot of the ones on Reverb have gold hardware, or they are 1960 reissues, not 1959. And I was pretty close to buying one of those just because of the limited availability. But I really wanted it to look like Pete's and Neil Young. So I splurged and made sure that I got one that had the, chrome hardware instead of the gold, which wouldn't have been accurate anyway for most of those models back then. So I'm really, really happy that it's the exact specs of what I wanted. It even has the thicker 59 body depth and everything. So it was really cool to finally get this thing and open it up and play it. And Pete Townshend tells a story that, when he plugged it in, the pickups on his were hotter. He said like 10 times hotter than the rest of his other guitars, which is kind of funny because Filtertrons, although they are hot, humbucking pickups, the resistance of them, which is kind of a value that you sort of used to determine the hotness and output level of the pickup, although it's not everything. Anyway, the Filtertrons generally run about 4 to 5 kilo ohms, which is pretty weak and quiet for a normal pickup. Your Strat and Tele pickups are about 6 or 7 kilo ohms. Humbuckers are 8 kilo ohms. And then for like modern active metal, loud pickups, those can go up to 12 or 14 kilo ohms. So 4 or 5 is not a very hot pickup, despite being a humbucker. But what a lot of people do is raise the pickup height. It's kind of hard to do. Sometimes you have to get in there and actually like remove the pickup itself, because it is a hollow body. There's nothing keeping it in place really, other than this mount. So anyway, a lot of people put the pickups and the pole pieces way up so that it gets a hotter sound, which is what I imagine Pete's had. So regardless, Pete said that it was super loud, louder than any of his other guitars. And when I first played mine, the first chord that I played on it was Won't Get Fooled Again, just that A chord. I just needed to hear what it could do on the bridge pickup, and it just was like, wow, it actually is like 10 times louder than any of my other guitars. It's like, it feels like I'm experiencing Pete's thing, all over again. It's the pickups are very high up, so that helps. But these are TV Jones classic pickups in here. It's really well made. It's made in Japan, this reissue. It's called the G6120T-59 Vintage Select Series. Just everything is so well crafted. The Bigsby is very usable and loose, and it stays in tune. It's just a really great guitar, and I've been kind of playing it against the Country Gentleman and the Tennessean. And I'm going to do that now for you. I'm going to show you the difference between the pickups and everything. So you're going to be hearing Michael Sokill is lending me this Country Gentleman, which has Filtertrons in it, but fake F-holes. So it's going to be a different experience with a double cutaway. And then you're going to hear the Gretsch Tennessean, my 1967, which has single coil Hylotron pickups in it, much weaker, twangier pickups. And it also has fake F-holes. So 3 very different guitars, but I would say, some of the most iconic Gretsches of all time. And while I have Michael's Gent, I gotta make sure I do a shootout. So anyway, I'm gonna leave you with that. You'll hear those guitars being, compared to each other. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really excited to do some covers with this thing. Definitely some Who and Beatles covers coming your way. Maybe even some Dylan or Aretha or Neil Young, Crosby, Stills, Nash covers. I'm just so giddy. As you can tell, I've blabbed for about half an hour. So thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe and enjoy the shootout.